All right. Okay. So it's probably been a while. Sometime last year, we ended up we were talking. We got up to the end of the seven trumpets, or should I say, we got up to the sixth trumpet. We've been talking about the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish empires, Islamic empires. It went for almost 1,000 years, and we've been talking about the Reformation. Did a lot of slides on the Reformation, just going through how the Lord talked about this big change that was coming, and again the republishing of the Bible and the beginning of the change. The Dark Ages had the Catholic system and Catholic religion sort of fairly dominant throughout there in the western part of Europe. In the eastern side of things, in the old Eastern Roman Empire, we had the Islamic religion and the Islamic empires dominating that. So we sort of got to the point now we're up to what's called the seventh trumpet, which the scripture makes a big deal about the fact that that is the last trump. Is one way of putting it. The Bible talks about the last trumpet. I'm not sure whether it's particularly referring to that in the book of Revelation, because there is a trumpet that sounds when the Lord returns, which is probably more the very last trumpet. But in the visions, we see that this seventh trumpet has another seven visions within it, and they're called the Seven Vials. So we're going to have just a bit of an introduction today, and then we're going to go through one by one in other instances, other sets of slides. We're going to go through the Seven Vials one by one. But basically, it's getting to the exciting part, because this all began to happen about 200 years ago, and these seven vials finish with the second coming of Jesus Christ. And it appears from, as these things have been traced down throughout history, that we are now in the last vial of the seven vials. So we've come to the very end of the visions, and coming to the end of the prophecy, and not much left to happen before the second coming of Jesus Christ. So we've got a picture there of modern warfare, and again that is because these things end up in our time, and pointing towards some of the great things that have happened. So I'm going to go through some of these points here again. Those that have seen them a million times, you'll have to bear with me. Those that haven't, it's sort of a bit more necessary for them. So in the book of Revelation, there are three sets of seven visions. One is called the seven seals, a seal as in a wax or clay seal. Then there are the seven trumpets, and then there are the seven vials. The vial means a bowl. We think of a vial as probably being a bit more like a vase or something like that, but in the Greek it actually means a bowl, and a shallow bowl, tended to be used for holding incense and that sort of thing. So there are three sets of approximately seven visions. They have some sub-visions within each set, but basically you have three sets of seven visions. And the whole prophecy of Revelation corresponds with the fourth great and last kingdom of Daniel's visions, and that is the one that comes before the kingdom of God, before the return of Jesus Christ. And that kingdom is Rome. The other three were Babylon, and then Persia, and then Greece under Alexander the Great, and then Rome takes over from there. So that's the succession of kingdoms. And this last one, Rome, was to have two phases to it. It was going to be the first phase was going to be completely iron, and in the vision, and then the second phase was going to be iron mingled with clay. And this was a broken up situation where it would basically break up into about 10 kingdoms, partly strong, partly weak, and they would be mingling with each other, but never quite have the great strength of the old imperial Rome. So that really corresponds to the European situation after the breakup of the Western Roman Empire. That broke up into the 10 kingdoms of Europe, and ever since then, for the last 1,500 years or so, that has been the case, and it is to be the case until Christ returns. So in these sets of visions, you can see there up the top, we've got the seven seals, and they cover the whole thing: the glory, the decline, and the fall of Rome. When we get to the seventh seal, That then is broken up into a vision of seven trumpets, the angels blowing seven trumpets. And that is all about the fall of the iron phase of Rome. So that's all about imperial Rome and imperial Rome coming to a close. And at the end of that, the seventh trumpet is a vision of seven angels holding bowls of fire which they pour out upon the earth. And each time one of these things happens, the angel sounds a trumpet or an angel pours out a bowl of fire, there is a vision that is associated with it. It's the key or the cue for another vision. And each of these represents an era or a time or great events in the history of the last 2,000 years. And they started at the time that John received the book of Revelation, which was around about 98 AD or so, and have continued on to this present day. And we are in the last one there, the seventh vial, the seventh bowl of wrath. So again, a bit more detail of what these represent. The first seal represented the glory of Rome. The next few seals there represented the things that happened in the decline of Rome. And the last one, the last seal, represented the fall of Rome. And that's why that is broken up into the subsequent visions of trumpets and vials. And that gives us, in other words, a bit more detail, because the fall is obviously the important part, and that's what leads up to the second coming of Christ. So when we have a look at the trumpet visions, basically the first four correspond to the fall of the Western Empire, and the next two correspond to the fall of the Eastern Empire, because Rome split up into to the two halves around about 400 AD. And then when we get to the seventh trumpet, that is about the fall of the iron and clay phase, or Papal Europe. And so they're a chronological series of visions, again, telling the history from John's time to the second coming of Jesus Christ. So in the seven seals, we got the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which a lot of people have heard of. And then there's various other visions, the vision of the altar and the martyrs, the earthquake and the eclipse, these things. And we go into the seven trumpets. As I say, the seven seals represent the whole decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And they have the subsets of the vials and the trumpets within them. We get to the seven trumpets. We've been going through those. Again, there are visions. It's all done in symbols, but the symbols can be read about in other stories in the Old Testament. That we've been going through some of the symbols and showing how they're interpreted in other parts of the scriptures. And it a bit like Jesus used parables, that we can understand what all these things meant. And it's interesting that a lot of the things that we've seen, the symbols that have been used, are the same symbols that historians use when they're trying to describe a particular event or battle in history and that sort of thing. They talk about, for example, Attila the Hun as being like a meteor. He was sudden, he was violent, and he sort of hit the ground and burnt out, but he did a lot of damage. And there's a lot of historians use the same symbols as what we see in the prophecies. So we've been looking at the seven trumpets. We've looked at the Turkish Empire. We looked at the Saracen Empire. We looked at the vision of the angel in the book. Quite a long prophecy there to do with the Reformation. And now we're in the seventh trumpet, which is the vision of the seven vials. So that's all about the fall of the Iron Kingdom, and we're in the last trumpet. Now, I also mentioned a while back, probably a couple of sets of slides ago, that the last three trumpets are called the three woe trumpets. In other words, Scripture says, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth because of these particular trumpets. And the fifth and the sixth trumpets particularly last for a very, very long time, pretty much the whole of the Dark Ages. And it is a time where both in the East and the West, there are two apostasies reigning. One is the Catholic system in the Dark Ages, and the other one is the Islamic empires in the East, and they dominate things for a very, very long time. And when we get to the seventh is the last trumpet, and as I say, that has the vision of the seven bowls within it. So these are the three last great woes in those trumpets, and then we have sort of a sevenfold explosion in the last one, It's a bit like Jericho, when Joshua walked around Jericho once each day, and on the seventh day he marched around it 7 times. So this is pretty much like the seventh time, and there are 7 visions associated with it. So this is where it's all starting to fall apart for the kingdoms of the world, and for the particularly the kingdom of the papacy, and the Catholic system and the Islamic systems. And this all starts to fall just before the return of Jesus Christ. So, 7 vials. There's some, again, we will be going through these individually, and we'll read the actual scriptures associated with them. But one talks about a great plague that comes upon people. One talks about the sea turning to blood. The third one talks about the rivers and the alpine areas turning to blood. The fourth one talks about the sun scorching men with great heat. The fifth one talks about the seat of the beast, or the throne of the beast, being darkened and brought to ruin. The sixth one talks about the drying up of the great river Euphrates, which was in the previous visions a reference to the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic empires which originated from the Euphrates and which occupy that area. And then there's a vision of 3 unclean spirits, which is actually part of the 6th vial, going out to bring all sorts of false ideologies and teachings and religions around the world, and gathering people together to war. And then we come to the 7th vial, which talks about a great earthquake. It talks about a great hailstorm, and it talks about the fall of Mystery Babylon. And then after that, the return of Jesus Christ. So that's what we're going to be looking at, the 7 vials. So I'm just having a bit of an introduction here on the thing as a whole, and then we'll go through the individual ones in subsequent presentations. So just again, a bit of a quick look at the timeline. So we can see there that the 7 seals, starting again around about 100 AD, when these things began to come to pass, they all happened fairly quickly. And then the first 4 trumpets again happened fairly quickly. Major events to do with the fall of the Western Empire in that particular case. And then we have this long period, which is indicated with actually there's a number of time frames associated with these particular periods, because it is a long period. It's the period that's really been emphasized right through the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation as being the worst time ever. And, you know, when things were particularly bad, this kingdom that was around then is not just a kingdom, but it's a false Christian kingdom. And so it's worse than the others, which are just pagan and, you know, worshipping other gods. This one is pretending to be worshipping Jesus Christ, but it actually holds the world in slavery and does some pretty atrocious things. So that whole era there, which I've got highlighted in red, is a period of 1260 years or more, in which, again, the Dark Ages sort of ruled, and we had these apostasies ruling. Then, as we've seen, we got to around the 1500s, and things started to change. We had the Reformation, and that began to break things up. We saw how that Britain pulled away from Europe, and then established, you know, became the Protestant fortress. And we've gone through, again, you might not remember this, but we have gone through and sort of taken that up to the end of the 1600s, when Britain basically, Protestantism was really established there, and the king had to be somebody who was Protestant, not Catholic. And so the Catholic system really lost their hold on Britain, and that was to have a great effect in the future. Then we come into the 1700s, and there begins to be a lot of upset within Europe against the Catholic Church and the Catholic system. Again, it's become very, very corrupt, and it's tied together with the corrupt nobility and the monarchies around through Europe. And there begins to be a lot of people who start stirring up other ideas. People like a lot of philosophers that sort of arose in the mid 1700s, particularly in France. There's a bit of a hotbed of that sort of thinking, and they could see the corruption that was in the monarchy and the nobility. They could see the corruption that was in the church, and as well as a whole lot of economic problems and other things that happened there. It caused them to start writing and producing a lot of propaganda and this sort of stuff. And people like Voltaire and Rousseau, I think that's how you pronounce his name, and quite a few others, they began to see the corruption that was there, and they began to, like a lot of people do today, they look at Christianity, what's called Christianity, and they get really upset with it, and they think it's hypocritical, and they think it's disastrous, and so they get very atheistic. The truth be known that they're not actually aware of what the Bible really teaches. They're just seeing all the hypocrites and the hypocrisy in these churches, and a lot of the superstition, a lot of the nonsense that was carried on, and so they reacted against that. As a result of that, in the late 1700s, we ended up with a Great Revolution, which started in France, which is in Western Europe, which was pretty much the seat, the real focus of Catholic Europe at the time. It was sort of the most dominant country. It was the original one that really sort of went into Catholicism to begin with. It was called the eldest son of the church, and it fell apart. And this incredible revolution, which we don't always get taught much about over here in Australia and New Zealand, but in Europe, it changed Europe, and it had a huge effect. We're going to be having a look at some of those thoughts. So things started to happen then, and in the last 200 years, as you can see there on the timeline, events have sort of moved fairly quickly down to the time that we're living in, which is the seventh vial, which took place or started in the 20th century. So there are another couple of chapters in between the things that we've already looked at and the ones that we're now looking at. The reason for that is the scriptures went through and they traced the fall of the Western Empire in Rome, and then they went through and traced the fall of the Eastern Empire of Rome, and we've been looking at that. That has to do with the rise of Islam and all the other things that happened there, and that was about a 1,000-year period. So there has been a lot of things happening in the West during that time. And the next couple of chapters, which talk about the dragon and the beast, and these are things we'll go through at another time, they are, if you like, the prophecy flicking back to where it left off in the West, and then picking up the papal side of the story and going through that, and then coming again to the same point in history where the seven vials begin. So I've left that out for the moment because I'm just doing it chronologically at the moment, which we've gone through the sixth trumpet, so now we're just going into the time of the seventh trumpet, and we'll pick up on that other history later. But what you can see here is that those prophecies that I haven't talked about there at the moment, they talk about the papacy and how that it would dominate and the Catholic system dominate, particularly it talks about a period of 1,260 years. And the rise of the papacy, you can see on this little circular timeline I've got here, is particularly dated from 476 was the time that the Western Empire broke up into the nations of Europe. And then the popes began to rise in power in Rome. And the emperor of the Roman Empire had moved to Constantinople in the east, and so he was sort of out of the way. And the popes began to sort of dominate through their religion in the new nations of Europe. And there's a couple of dates that are quoted quite often. Were quoted a long time back as being the start of the Pope's real power over the other nations, where he began to be perceived as sort of the universal bishop over all other bishops, and took this power to him. And those dates were around about AD 529 to 33 and AD 606 to 610. And if you take from those dates 1,260 years, you come to a couple of dates at the end there, AD 1789 to 93 and AD 1866 to 70. So a lot of the beginning of this period of the seven vials that we're talking about is in this period, and it actually begins with those dates. And those are the dates of the French Revolution, where Catholicism and the papacy began to collapse in Europe. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So a few scriptures here, just going through the thought of the vision of the seven vials. So in Revelation 15, verse 1, it says, "And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvellous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God." So what we're talking about again, particularly you notice this phrase, the wrath of God, is very much associated with these vials or these bowls. And this is, we've looked at 1800 years pretty much of history and prophecy, and this is the last of it. This is the final crunch. This is the climax. This is where it becomes very, very severe. And it says, "And the 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure and white linen, and having their breasts girded with golden girdles. And one of the 4 beasts gave unto the 7 angels 7 golden vials or bowls, full of the wrath of God, who liveth for ever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled." So this again is the coming up to the climax of these particular visions. Goes on in the next chapter, and it says, "And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the 7 angels, Go your ways and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth. And the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image." So that's the vision of the first vial there, which we'll go into more detail another time. But again, the thought was this is how it went. The angels were called forth. They poured out their bowl poured out their bowl upon the earth of fire, and various things happened in the visions. The first one was this noisome and grievous sore upon the men. And particularly, as it says there, upon the men that had the mark of the beast, upon them which worshipped his image. So those that were associated with this system and this whole Catholic system, etc., they were going to be the target of this whole problem. So what actually happened at this time was, it is an age which is known as the Age of Revolution. It was a time where, back in the time of Isaac Newton, he was writing at the end of the 1600s, and he believed in these things, and he realised that the 7 seals basically had been fulfilled. The 7 trumpets had almost been fulfilled, but he realised that the 7 vials had not yet come to pass, and he was looking forward and thinking that these things might come to pass fairly soon, and everybody was waiting for the next big thing, which was the vision of the 7 vials. And then we had this age of revolution came into Europe. There were big changes, lots of different things were happening. There had been what they call the age of, or the scientific revolution, which Isaac Newton had been part of that, and before that there were various astronomers and people who had started to look into the heavens and look into science and come to a better understanding of things, and put away the superstition of the Catholic Church and the teachings there. And that sort of then led into what's called the Age of Enlightenment, where people started to look into reasoning rather than superstition. And again, that sort of opened people's eyes a bit. And then, as I say, we had all these philosophers and philosophies, people looking into and realising that they didn't have to be ruled by a monarchy, and maybe there were other ways of doing things. And again, when people were very much oppressed and under suffering, and they got sick and tired of all the nonsense from both the church and the nobles, it ushered in this age of revolution. And that pretty much started with the American Revolution, and they fought their war of independence from Britain, and the French were involved in that. And again, that's sort of around the 1770s. And then shortly after that, we have this revolution which broke out in France itself, which was the revolution of revolutions. It was the mother of all revolutions, and it pretty much changed everything and caused the whole of Europe to erupt into revolutions over the next few decades, and its effects have continued right on to today and sort of led into the world wars. So there was a fellow, I can't remember what his name was, but he said, when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. the whole of Europe catches a cold. So it's sort of, if anything was going to happen, and it happened in France, that would affect everywhere. Indeed, it has affected the whole world. So this age of revolution went right through to the 1820s and the 1830s, the 1848, there were big revolutions. They started involving many nations. I think in 1848 I saw a comment that there were about 50 nations that were involved in the revolutions that were triggered off by these things. They all really pretty much started in France. So France had a huge effect. So a couple of general statements about this particular age, which is the beginning of the Seven Vials. So the age of revolution in the Britannica says during the decades of economic and social transformation, Western Europe also experienced massive political change. So there were other big changes. It was the industrial age, the age of industrialisation. Big changes there, and steam engines were being invented and all sorts of things. Machinery was coming in and changing everything. And this was all happening at the same time. But with these revolutions, there were a lot of political change as well. So the central event throughout much of the continent was the French Revolution, 1789 to 99, and its aftermath. Now, this was followed by a concerted effort at political reaction and a renewed series of revolutions from 1820 through 1848. The French Revolution was a period of far-reaching social and political upheaval in France and its colonies, beginning in 1789. The revolution overthrew the monarchy, established a republic, catalysed violent periods of political turmoil, and finally culminated in a dictatorship under Napoleon, who brought many of its principles to areas he conquered in Western Europe and beyond. Inspired by liberal and radical ideas, the revolution profoundly altered the course of modern history, triggering the global decline of absolute monarchies while replacing them with republics and liberal democracies. Through the Revolutionary Wars, it unleashed a wave of global conflicts that extended from the Caribbean to the Middle East. Historians widely regard the revolution as one of the most important events in human history. So again, as I say, we don't learn a lot of that sort of history over here, but it was a major thing. It was the remaking. I've got a book at home which talks about this period. It talks about it as the remaking of Europe, and at this particular time, the entrance into the modern age. And so it really had a global effect. It not only affected Europe, but it affected all the colonies in places like Africa and elsewhere, and the Caribbean, as it mentions there. And it began to change things right around the world. And it was a revolution that was, there's been a lot of revolutions, and generally they tend to be, there's a lot of bloodshed and war associated with them. But this one particularly was extremely bloodthirsty, and there's all sorts of horrible images that we have from this particular time. You've probably heard of the guillotine. The guillotine was something which was invented at the time of the French Revolution to supposedly quickly and humanely do away with the victims. But even though it was supposed to be a humane way to die, it became used so much that, you know, the blood was literally pouring through the streets, and in the rivers. There were so many people sort of drowned and other things done to them. It was a very, very horrible sort of a time. And they were looking to make a better society, but they ended up making things worse, certainly during that time. And it ended up with a dictator taking over, who was Napoleon, and he again brought war throughout Egypt, a bit like an olden day Adolf Hitler, as far as his results went. So there's an interesting little quote here, like this one, talking about the legacy of the French Revolution. It says, when China's premier, Zhou Enlai, if that's how you say it, was asked in 1972 whether he thought the French Revolution had been a good or a bad thing, he mused for a few moments and then replied, it's too early to tell. So that sort of gives you some idea of the fact that, you know, the effects of the French Revolution are still resounding down through the ages, and it's still having its effect. It still has changed history, and it's still caused a lot of movement. And people, again, there's been a lot of revolutions since, and a lot of them have sort of been based on the French Revolution and taken their cue from it. Another quote here says, "For the average person, all problems date to World War II, for the more informed to World War I, for the genuine historian to the French Revolution." So again, we sort of think about the more recent things, but they sort of have their foundation, is what he's saying here, back with the French Revolution. So the French Revolution started off something which affected the whole of Europe and brought Napoleon on the scene. It affected the whole world, the colonies throughout the world. It really turned everything upside down. It brought down monarchies all over the place and brought in republics and brought in democracies of one form or another. And again, not all of that was good. Again, people sort of argue very much about whether the French Revolution had a good result or a bad result. And did say it had some good things, some good results about it, but the actual method that brought them about was not good at all. It was very murderous and very bloodthirsty. And inevitably, those that started off the revolution and that began killing many people, they ended up being killed themselves and being executed themselves. So there was a bit of a saying at the time that the revolution eats its own. In other words, it's sort of a bit like the Bible verse says, "If you bite and devour one another, take heed lest you be consumed." And that's exactly what happened in the French Revolution. They began to bite and devour one another, and they began to be consumed one of another. So again, as I said, it was the age also from the mid-1700s through of machinery, the age of machines and industry, which particularly got going in Britain, and really enabled the British Empire to take off and become a great empire. So there were a lot of things that were changing, and this is, as we know, in the last couple of last 100 years, there have been huge leaps in progress as far as technology and all sorts of things. Our world is a very, very different place than what it used to be. We had horse and cart for thousands of years. And then suddenly, in the last couple of 100 years, things have gone in leaps and bounds. At the beginning of the 1900s, we had powered flight, and we think of the old stop with camels and things, the biplanes, and then we went from them. Within just decades, we went to jet planes. We've gone to rockets which land upon the moon, and all sorts of things, satellites, and space stations and all this sort of thing. So it has been a huge time of change and has had a huge effect. So that's the whole era, that's the character of the era that we're talking about. And one of the other things that happened during this time is that as papal Europe was going down the tube, so to speak, as it was going down the drain, it was in conflict with Britain and also ended up with the USA. And during this time also, when we get into the 20th century, we find that Britain and the USA and Israel began to be on the rise. And at the same time the French Revolution was happening, Britain became the United Kingdom around about 1800. And we see that they then began to, both there and in the USA, there was a huge drive for sending out missions and sending out the Bible. All these Bible societies formed, and there was a great passion for spreading the Bible through the world. So it's pretty much as the Roman papal system is going down, there is a rise, on the other hand, of the gospel and the Bible, and the nations that we believe are the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. And that has been sort of as a parallel theme through this particular era as well. So to say, we've got the 7 vials, we've got the various symbols in these particular visions. There's one, as I mentioned, of a plague, one where the sea turns to blood, one where the rivers turn to blood, scorching sun, the seat of the beast, drying up of the Euphrates, etc. So when we have a look at the 7 vials, there's a bit of a timetable there. And starting around about the 1789 was when the French Revolution began. But from 1750 was where there was a lot of foment and a lot of people, again, pushing propaganda and sort of pushing in this direction. So there was a lot of upset and a lot of publications against the monarchy and against the church, Catholic Church, pointing out all the horrible things they were doing. People like Voltaire, if you know who Voltaire is, he was particularly incensed. What really got him going was the Catholic Church and all the nonsense that the Catholic priests and others were doing, and the fact that they were massacring people, and the fact that they, again, were bringing some terrible punishments and executions against people. And that was, his thoughts. They were sort of some of these philosophers, because of that, they were pushed in a very atheistic sort of direction. And so what they sort of their way of bringing in the revolution was to bring in very anti-God sorts of ideas, because they thought that Christianity was the Catholic Church, and so they're very much against that. And then they became very much against God. So it had this whole system that sort of began. We had the nobility, which was very corrupt. The monarchies were very corrupt. We had the church, which was very, very corrupt. And we had also this other aspect, which was the very atheistic sort of push. And they all just collided. And as a result of that, we had this terrible mess. Nobody is right, but we had this terrible mess which comes out of it. Now, the Seven Vials, there's some similarities between these and the trumpets. And it talks about the first vial is poured out upon the earth, upon the men that have the mark of the beast. That's the same as the first trumpet, where the visions there came upon the earth, or the land area particularly. Then the next one was poured out upon the sea, and referring to naval battles and that sort of thing, which was the same in the trumpets, that the trumpet was sounded, the second trumpet was sounded, and the sea turned to blood. Again, the same thing happens here with the vials. And then the third one, again, is the same as the trumpets. It was poured out upon the rivers and the alpine areas, the riverlands of places like Germany and France, and the big rivers there, the Rhine, etc., the Danube. Those were the areas that really copped these wars. And the fourth one, again, just as it was with the trumpets, had to do with the heavens, in this case the sun. And then we get into the fifth vial is poured out upon the seat of the beast, which has to do with the Rome and the Vatican. And then we have the sixth vial is poured out upon the river Euphrates, which in previous visions referred to the Islamic Empire. So that has to do with the drying up of the Ottoman Empire. And then the last one is different. It's never ever happened before in the other visions, but this one is poured out into the air. So there's a new, whereas the other ones there sort of referred to the other arenas of war, upon the sea, naval warfare, or upon the riverlands, or upon the sun and the moon and the stars, represent the powers that be. This one is poured out into the air, and that corresponds with the beginning of the First World War. And we know, of course, that the aerial warfare sort of began from that time, so it all corresponds as well. So this is the basic timeline. So it starts off there with the first vial and the time of the French Revolution, and goes right through to our time. And we're in the seventh vial, but we're actually not completely through it yet. There's a couple of things yet described to happen. So just going to flick through some pictures here. The first vial has to do with the French Revolution. I'm not going to go into the details now, but I'm just going to read these things out, give you a bit of an overview. First vial has to do with the French Revolution. The second vial has to do with naval warfare in the French Revolution. This involves people like Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar, some of those famous ones you might know of. We've got Nelson up north in the South Island, and that is named after Nelson, the commander, and also a lot of the street names and things are named after the various battles and all of that. Third vial has to do with the rivers turning to blood, and again that was where the French Revolutionary Wars were fought, in the riverland areas there. The fourth vial has to do with the sun and scorching men, and again this represents the time of Napoleon, and the Napoleonic Wars, which again was, I'm sure we all realise, was a great time in history. Very important time. The fifth vial has to do with the seat of the beast, or Rome, being lost to the papacy. In this particular time, the papacy lost the papal lands and also lost Rome, and was reduced to just the few acres which we now know as Vatican City within Rome. And the Pope used to be in charge as a king of those lands, had his own kingdom literally, but in 1870 that all came to a sudden close. There was the loss of the papal kingdom. The sixth vial had to do with the Ottoman Empire beginning to dry up, which happened again in the 1800s, particularly towards the end of the 1800s, and eventually they came to a close in the First World War. But they lost a lot of their land even before that particular time, and they came to an end. So then we entered into the seventh vial, which we believe has to do with the world wars, First and Second World Wars, and the things that happened there. And then it talks about the next thing to happen is the fall of Mystery Babylon, which it goes into 2 chapters on, really emphasise that's the climax of everything, just before the Lord returns. And it says also there'll be a great storm of war at that time. So we are right at the end of those things. So last slide, again looking at that timeline there, the French Revolution, the Revolutionary Wars at sea, this is what we're going to be looking at. The Revolutionary Wars on land, the Napoleonic Wars, the loss of the Papal States and Rome, decline of the Ottoman Empire, and into the 20th century with the World Wars, and what we are expecting to happen any time soon. So we're coming to the end of the prophecy of Revelation. It's a very big prophecy, but it's very detailed and goes into a lot of stuff, so we're going through that at a later stage. All right, we'll leave it there.